Hi, I'm Tommy, and I'm a professional paleontologist. By day, I use the latest data science techniques to reconstruct ecological and evolutionary changes from the fossil record. But by night, I investigate cryptids, the paranormal, mediumship, the occult, politics, history, philosophy, and even God himself. You know, all the things that good little scientists are supposed to avoid. If you want to join me on my journey, friend, be so kind as to like and subscribe. And welcome to Creepy Puppets Presents. It's the last week of class before finals week at the university where I work, so I'm rather busy, and so this week I'm doing a shorter video that's only really tangentially related to Autism Awareness Month. As an autistic person, I think you always have to be aware of psychology. You need to be aware of psychology, because the psychology community is always trying to define you, and you need to be able to define yourself in their terms, using their language, but in your own way. And as an evolutionary biologist by training and profession, I find that the theory of evolutionary psychology is the most persuasive psychological theory and the most empowering psychological theory for reasons that'll be clear shortly. But I'm not just autistic. If my voice didn't give it away, and, the fact that I've done a drag parody, I'm not entirely cis. And there's a loud voice among the intersectional left that believes evolutionary psychology is not only pseudoscience, but queerphobic pseudoscience. This opinion isn't just left-wing creationism, but like intersectionalism generally, is incredibly reactionary if you think about it for just a few minutes. My thesis in this video is that if evolutionary psychology is true, ad argumendum, evolutionary psychology isn't just progressive and queer positive, it's the most progressive and queer positive model of psychology currently on the table. Now, I suspect the creationist left's hostility comes in part from a straw man of evolutionary psychology advanced by reactionary ideologues, or psychologists with little professional biological training, or in Jordan Peterson's case, both. So let me offer a brief explanation of evopsych from a trained evolutionary biologist. Anyone familiar with the science of autism knows that autistic behavior is rooted in neurology. So behavior sometimes has a biological component, and evolutionary psychologists claim we can experimentally distinguish these behaviors from behaviors that are learned using the principles of evolutionary biology. The evolutionary psychologist looks at a behavior and wonders, can this behavior be explained by an adaptation, or perhaps as some adaptation gone wrong? And if it can, it might serve as an hypothesis. But, and this is critical, we have to test those hypotheses. This seems to be a fact that the creationist left seems to ignore. The first thing we want to check is the universality of the behavior. If people in every culture exhibit this behavior, that increases the likelihood of a biological component as opposed to a sociological one. And that's why evolutionary psychology can't be used to justify scientific racism. If just black people do something, that makes the behavior much less likely to have a biological component. The next thing we want to look at is if that behavior is exhibited in other species, especially closely related species like primates. This is why it's difficult to use evolutionary psychology to argue that men are better at physics, because we are the only species to develop physics. So we can't really test that hypothesis. The much more likely explanation has to do with how universities' science departments recruit their students, which is of course intimately linked to how those departments are funded, which as a Marxist is deeply satisfying. Suck it, intersectionalists. Here's the real reason evolutionary psychology is hated by the creationist left. We have lots of reasons to think that not just gender, the sense of ourselves as men and women, but also gendered behavior has a biological component. To wit, gender can't just be socially constructed. The classic example is spontaneous choice. Cross-culturally, when children are given the choice between social toys like dolls and non-social toys like trucks, boys are much more likely to pick the non-social toys, while girls are much more likely to pick social toys. The same result has been found in primates, and newborn human babies also exhibit gendered preference for social stimulus versus non-social stimulus. Mate guarding is another gendered behavior that is well supported by the evolutionary psychology model. Gender as neurology runs afoul of performativity theory of gender, the dominant theory of gender in the social sciences. According to this theory, gender is socially constructed, learned behavior, which we perform outwardly and is reinforced by society's response to our performance. Now, if you have been following the debate over ABA therapy, You might recognize performativity as a thinly veiled version of behaviorism, and that's really the problem here. Evolutionary psychology holds that gender queerness is a real, immutable fact of biology. Trans people and non-binary people are born that way, and to pick one example, trans women literally are women in men's bodies, specifically women's brains, or at least partly women's brains, in male bodies. Gender queerness is a form of neurodiversity on this model. Evolutionary psychology is skeptical of behavioral change. So in our view, you can't change gender queerness or homosexuality any more than you can cure autism. And for the TECA folks in the back, you can't cure autism. My lack of cisness is rooted in my neurology, probably arising from the same mechanisms that make me autistic, which is probably why there's such an overlap between the autistic community and LGBT people. And again, this can't be changed. I find this message to be incredibly empowering. But if gender is socially constructed, gender queerness is just social rebellion, and conceivably could be changed. It's no coincidence that behaviorists like Ivar Lovaas invented conversion therapy. Performative gender effectively concedes the conversion therapist point. Protection from conversion therapy is no longer its scientific impossibility, but just an appeal to the morality of transphobes. But there's also an ableist element here, because performativity theorists need an explanation for the autistic LGBT overlap that I mentioned just a minute ago. The most popular theory I've seen among the creationist left is that autistic people lack the social awareness to be indoctrinated into gender conformity, which is two ableist tropes in one: presumed incompetence and inspirational disability. There are other social issues that evolutionary psychology can help with as well. For example, if we think mate guarding is a sexist behavior, then understanding that the people who engage in mate guarding aren't entirely doing that of their own will, and that can help improve outreach by not attacking them for doing it as being inherently sexist. I have yet to encounter a theory of psychology that offers more protections to autistic and LGBT people than does evolutionary psychology. The creationist left that opposes evolutionary psychology are actively degrading the condition of those groups, and actively promoting the ideology of conversion and ABA therapists. That's all for now, friends. Take care.